Okay, Aaron, welcome back. It's really good to be talking with you again. Um,
Yeah, thank you for having me.
so we
Great.
talked last several months ago, and I was really fascinated by your thesis on Nietzsche, and particularly looking at, well, taking a different perspective on Nietzsche, one that's a little less anti-religious, a Nietzsche that's a little more pious, as the title of the thesis suggests. Since then, though, and we had a great discussion about that, since then I've been going deeper into Nietzsche. Um, I had read some Nietzsche, a little bit of Nietzsche as a teenager. I think I read a bit of Nietzsche in my 20s as well. But then just within the last few months, I reread or read um, Gay Science, Zarathustra, and Beyond Good and Evil. Last year, I also read Twilight of the Idols, Ecce Homo, so the
Mhm.
later works, the Antichrist. Um, and so,
Impressed.
yeah, I've been digesting a lot of Nietzsche now, and it's also interesting coming at it from a slightly older, more mature perspective. It's still kind of intoxicating, I guess, but it's also, you can be a little more critical, I think, and objective than maybe if you're just ingesting it as a teenager. Anyway,
Yeah, and I also think I can imagine, at least I'm curious if you had the same experience, that that first time that I read it, it was like almost like there was a whole new perspective on the world that was forming sort of in me as I was reading it. So I was taking it in at the same time. So it was a huge shock to read it. And it's like now I feel like I've more or less integrated some of that. It's still shocking to some extent. So that also, so besides the fact that I'm an adult and I can be a little bit more critical, it's also like I feel like I've integrated some of the perspectives
yes.
that I thought were life-changing in some sense, you
Yes,
know? Yeah.
definitely. I feel similarly. I feel like I'm coming at it from a different level, if you will. Like there's multiple layers. I guess it's similar to religion, in the sense that, there's a superficial layer of religion, not to denigrate it, but there's like a more literal superficial layer. Um, and then you assimilate that, maybe you reject it or certain elements of it, but then you come to it again, and there's a deeper layer. I feel like
Yeah.
similarly with Nietzsche, that's been my experience to some extent. There's kind
By
of,
the way,
yeah,
that's curious because that's definitely something we could talk about if something like Zarathustra, which Nietzsche, in his letters talked about, oh, I want it to be read as the Bible, if it
yes.
lends itself to that more superficial reading too, or if it's just something that should be read esoterically, but because that's obviously part of the interpretation. But we'll go on about that later, I guess.
Okay, I'll
Yeah.
I'll um I'll just make a quick note of that so we come back to that because I think it's a really
Yeah.
interesting point. But anyway, so I guess I'm just kind of setting the scene for the discussion. So I've been reading Nietzsche. I did a big video on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche's arguably greatest, certainly most influential book. Um, and particularly looking at it through the perspective of one Nietzsche scholar, one commentator, Lawrence Lampert. Um, and really, no, like it was, I hate to say it, it was somewhat of a religious experience. Like I think that
Cool.
if he was crafting Zarathustra to be a kind of Bible, um, I mean,
Mhm.
it's certainly compelling. It certainly gives you a different worldview. I mean, I think that part of it was Lampert's interpretation. Like, I think I wouldn't have understood it anywhere near that depth if I didn't have that assistance. Um,
Right. Would
and
you say that
mm,
maybe it's similar because I know you also have videos, for instance, Alan Bloom and Plato's Republic.
mhm.
Do you think it's similar to that it's maybe not a Bible in itself, but it's so fundamental that and it also like the Republic also has, let's say, literary drama that when you
Yes,
feel that's properly revealed to you, it's like, whoa, this is fundamental, monumental work
I
of
think it
philosophy.
is. I mean, I don't want to commit myself to that, but I feel like it is. That was my felt reaction.
Yeah.
The question of whether it's a fundamental work is still maybe unresolved because it's still so new. Something like the Republic, we can say quite definitively is a fundamental work, even more so the Bible. Part of what Lawrence Lampert is arguing, though, is that it will be a fundamental work, that Nietzsche instigates a new epoch almost of human history. Um, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. First, I want to, so this is part of the reason I wanted to talk to you again, was having come through this little journey into Nietzsche, or at least a bit further into Nietzsche. I wanted to talk to you more about Nietzsche. And so I want to start off by just asking you, because you watched that video commentary on Zarathustra, and based upon that, what's your take on Lampert's take on Nietzsche? Where do you feel like he's hit on something true, and where do you maybe have some doubts, or you feel like he's gone down the wrong path?
Right. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. Like I think from what I gathered from your video, which by the way, like if people haven't watched it or listened to it, like I can highly recommend it. It's a really wonderful overview of everything. And by the way, like I think it had this tension of sometimes kind of being like a reader's guide, and then sometimes kind of being like, okay, but this is specifically Lampert interpretation. And listening to your video, it wasn't always 100% clear to me when it was like, okay, this is just sort of like, this is just, let's say, just trying to make it more accessible. And this, like, by the way, this would be my interpretation of it. So that I'm kind of curious about where you think those differ. Like, okay, where it's like, okay, this is the usual interpretation, and this is like Lambert's interpretation. I know like the general picture, what we also briefly discussed in terms of, like a definite ontology and will to power, but I guess we'll get back to that. But what I mostly found, I will say honestly, like one thing that I struggled with in terms of Lampert's approach is that this is obviously in some sense like a very mystical work, like almost like mythical, poetical. Like you can add like different layers to it. And I would say like in the Republic, if we're going to use that comparison by Plato, like Plato plays with like the forms, the eternal forms, and then the philosopher has the cave and goes out of the cave, and obviously this is like that, but more or less like upside down, right? Like he goes from the cave like down to humanity, as you also addressed in your video, and that makes this book a little bit more difficult for me to approach it the way that Lampert does, because it kind of seems that Nietzsche wants, in some sense, to get rid of some of, let's say, the metaphysical baggage that Plato has. But that also means that it kind of loses some of its value if it's then sort of explained sort of almost like too literally. That it's like, okay, Nietzsche used this character to kind of mean this. Because in Plato, you sometimes feel, and obviously you have that to a huge extent in religious texts. It's like, okay, you can kind of see like, oh, I think this probably has to do with this, but I guess the author didn't even completely know what the author was doing. And I see that a little bit more in Nietzsche, that I'm like, and that's why I like some of those criticisms of him too. Is like, okay, Nietzsche was, like he wasn't fully in control in some sense. Like he was being led on by some kind of unconscious drive too, which would, I think, also be consistent with some of his philosophical ideas. And I think he describes it that way too, like that he really felt, like he experienced that he was like being overtaken by something. And that means that some of those mystical aspects of the text, if I dare call them that, but my arguments for him being a religious thinker, they would not lend themselves as easily to, let's say, a clear-cut interpretation, which is also, and that's sort of my caveat for this whole conversation, let's say, why I've been a little bit scared of this work. I'll be very honest, like that I'm kind of like I've read it and I found it fairly difficult, and even hearing like the the interpretations. Oh, this is the Übermensch, and the Übermensch has this relevance for Nietzsche. I still find like the fact that Carl Jung like gave a seminar on it, and the full form of that is published in like 1600 pages. Like it's kind of like, and that's just one thinker who was like, okay, we need to look at the symbolism of this. And then I'm like, I haven't had the time to look at, like, for instance, that interpretation of 1600 pages, that I don't feel confident yet to claim that some of these symbolic or archetypal choices, or stylistic choices that Nietzsche makes can be interpreted so easily. Having said that, so sorry to go on a
So
tangent.
just a
Having said,
clarifying point. Sorry, just a clarifying point
yeah,
on that. You you would say that it can't be so easily interpreted, maybe because it's archetypal, because it's something
Yeah.
that's not just a conscious product of one individual. Is that kind of what you're?
Right, right.
Mm.
I think that would more or less be it. And I think Nietzsche would probably have to conclude that too. And that
Hmm.
there's something about the names he's working with, let's say, like maybe a little bit less so in Zarathustra, but like Dionysius and obviously Zarathustra himself, is that he he is very much aware that if he says, God is dead, but for centuries onwards, I think, or maybe millennia onwards, I kind of forgot, like we'll see like God's shadow in the cave. So he's
Yes.
aware of this like sort of massive force that some of
Yes.
these ideas have upon people, and therefore I don't think it's so easily said like, okay, but you know, Dionysus is dead and Zarathustra is dead, so we can just kind of use them here. No, it seems like he wants to revive them, and if you genuinely want to revive some of these archetypal religious ideas, then you are in some sense being used by them,
Yes.
and not using them
Yes.
completely consciously. I find that tricky to just argue that, if that makes sense.
That's a
Yeah.
good point. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off. What were you going to say?
No, 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 no. I just wanted to say, having said that, like it's
Mm.
obviously fascinating. Like
Hmm.
having like listened to your video, I'm like, wow, okay, that actually does make sense. I can definitely imagine that, for instance, Lampert picks up on very important things that Nietzsche has like tried to point out. Like so some of it I can't, and that's really where I would like to read the work for myself and take a little bit more time with it and maybe compare
Hmm.
it to other interpretations. But that's where I really have been very impressed, because I couldn't for like for instance the last dance, like the dance song, I mean, in
Hmm.
Zarathustra, like I don't have like an alternative
Yeah.
interpretation for that. I'm like, well, he's
Yeah.
wrong because so I'm not gonna be like a specific critic. I can just say intuitively I sometimes felt that this wasn't the type of approach that I personally would take. But seeing the approach and being it done so like seeing it done so successfully was, yeah, just really impressive. So I also wanted to mention that. But I'm curious, like obviously, what well, two questions. What drew you to like saying like, okay, I want to get into Zarathustra? And did you read it again before you read the approach, or did you read the approach right away? And indeed, it was a religious experience. So maybe you can speak a little bit to like maybe describing that a little bit more precisely, like on which points precisely, and do you feel because of Lampert mostly, or because you felt that Nietzsche was shining through Lampert's explanation? So I'm really curious. Yeah.
Yeah. So remind me, what was the first question?
The first question is, what drew you to reading
Ah,
these works?
yes.
To like, why did you want to pick it up again? So like, what's going on? Yeah.
So yeah, good question. I mean, for me, I would say the thing that occupies my mind a lot in the last, let's say, couple of years has been this question of immanence and transcendence and how the two relate. Um, and there's a sort of abstract metaphysical way you can think about that, and that's interesting, but there's also a very existentially relevant way, um, which is sort of like how to put it. I mean, Nietzsche deals with it very well. He kind of, as we talked about in our last conversation, he talks about Dionysus versus the crucified. And so, at least in his view, I think Dionysus would represent an immanent, fully immanent way of living, where you affirm life in nature as it is, um, and there's nothing beyond it, and there doesn't need to be anything beyond it. Whereas the crucified would more represent the affirmation of transcendent ideals, or a
Mhm.
transcendent reality that's better than and above our reality that we live in, which for Nietzsche is
Mhm.
problematic because that denigrates our reality. But the upside of it is that you can preserve a sense in which there is or could be a cosmic justice, that the evil and suffering of life as it is isn't essential to it, but is somehow an aberration or somehow something that will be redeemed or solved at the end of time, all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's a question that occupies my mind, and partly it's because I don't know where I stand religiously. I'm very attracted to Christianity. I
Mhm.
think I'll talk sort of very briefly about my trajectory. My trajectory has been being raised in a Christian church denomination, not extremely strictly or anything like that, but still raised religiously, religious schooling. And kind of in my early teens, kind of discovering other religions and being really fascinated with them. Later teens, getting very much into Nietzsche to some extent, or at least stuff about Nietzsche. Although I do remember reading The Genealogy of Morals at the time. More than Nietzsche, though, I liked a thinker, don't know how much you know about him, Max Stirner.
Yeah, like a little bit. Like obviously, I also know there's controversies on whether or not Nietzsche
Whether Nietzsche
plagiarized
read him or not. Yeah, yeah.
Stirner, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's a very thoroughgoing, I guess you could say, certainly an egoist. That's how he identifies. But I think you could also say a nihilist as well. But also in a curious way, like he's quite joyful about it. He's not lamenting it. He's just very consistent that, you know,
Yeah.
he's an egoist.
I,
So,
I kind of feel like sometimes like I remember just as an undergrad, I did this presentation on kind of comparing Camus and Dostoevsky and kind of
mhm,
coming very strongly on the side of Dostoevsky, like who I very much appreciate, even though now I really appreciate Camus as well. But then I felt that comparison of, let's say, two individuals. So I'm not sure how familiar you are, but like I don't think this is a spoiler because it's like it happens at the start of the book and it's really
mhm,
central. Like in both books, like L'étranger, so the
mhm,
stranger,
yep,
Camus, like you have the protagonist killing someone.
mhm,
And obviously, it moves to a trial and stuff. So I'm
mhm,
not gonna go into that. And you have that as well in Crime and Punishment, where the protagonist kills someone,
mhm,
and you can see how they deal with it. But essentially in Camus, the main character is like a psychopath who
mhm.
doesn't care too much about the murder itself, but it's more like he's almost making more societal points, like
Yes,
Camus, like, okay, how
yes,
do people respond to this, which I've started to appreciate a little bit more later on, even though I knew about it at the time. But whereas with Dostoevsky, you really get into, like, let's say, the inner world of the individual. And
yes,
just hearing to you like characterize, look, listening to you characterize Sterner a little bit, it almost sounds like similar, that it's like, he's just happy being an egoist,
yes.
where Nietzsche is kind of like conflicted and like, oh, what do I do, but because I also have this part of me. So
Yeah, I
kind
think that's
of,
very apt. Yeah, Nietzsche is definitely more like that. And there is that sense that Nietzsche has a deep kind of feeling of compassion or pity. He kind of refers to it in different ways. Even in Zarathustra, there's references to it. In book 4,
yeah,
for instance, his whole temptation is that his pity for man. And there's
yeah,
another somewhere else that says something like, life is life is deep, and just as deep as suffering, just as deep as pity for man, something like that. So um, Nietzsche is
right,
definitely more the Raskolnikov figure than someone
yeah,
like Camus, at least what I know
yeah,
about Camus, or certainly Stirner, who just sort of,
so yeah,
yeah. And so yeah, I would identify myself overall less with that conflicted figure, and more with the kind of um, the other option, I guess, the Stirnerian option, but not
mhm,
simply, because I wasn't sort of satisfied with that philosophy. And so I kind of re-encountered Christianity, and that would have been in my early 20s. And then
mhm,
kind of just sort of circled around it, kind of rejoined the church that I grew up in a couple of times, but never fully reassimilated into that. But
yeah,
certainly came to a sense of um, deep appreciation for Christianity, because when I was sort of looking at different religions, and then I was sort of going in a more nihilistic direction, I was kind of just assumed that it was stupid, that compared to like Buddhism or Hinduism, for instance, it wasn't really that sophisticated. But of course, I
mm,
saw that was like completely wrong. Um, so anyway,
right, yeah,
now
no, that's
coming back to Nietzsche again, I'm sort of more asking the question of, well, where do I stand in terms of like what's my worldview? What's my like what's a way to live? Um,
mhm,
and so I chose Zarathustra specifically because you know, it's the book that Nietzsche kind of refers to as his greatest book, as the definitive book, like as the thing that, you know, that's the thing that we should read. That's the yes saying book, after which comes the no saying books. This is his positive vision. So I wanted to see what that positive vision was. And I was particularly interested in, well, could you have like a immanent, fully immanent vision of the world that is joyful, affirmative, positive? Um, because my experience with Stirner and sort of nihilism in general was that well, it wasn't that fulfilling, I suppose. And so I wanted to
Mm.
sort of find a steel-manned version of that kind of strain of thought. And I think through Lampert, I think it was just chance that I chose a Lampert because I was just looking for a commentary for Zarathustra. And but I think he provides it. Like he provides like a positive vision. Now, how much of that is him and how much of that is Nietzsche, you know, that's debatable. But if we want to just focus on Lampert, I think Lampert provides a very livable, sort of affirmative, more or less healthy view of the world that one could live in. And Lampert's very interested in sort of actually promoting this, I think. And well, he's passed on now, but that was his kind of mission in some sense.
Right.
He kind of talks about having a moment where he sort of figured out what the dance song means, and he went from being like a neutral scholar to being an active kind of advocate, a Nietzschean, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
So yeah, I mean that's sort of where
And
I am and
can
why I
you, by the way,
chose. Yeah.
can you now that we're like also I'm aware of people obviously listening to this. So can you take me to specifically that part of the book? Like, so let's say the dance
Mhm.
song.
Yes.
Just remind me very quickly what it was for Lampert, and I'm also curious if you agree and follow Lampert in
Yes.
that regard.
Let me just grab the book for a sec so I can look at it.
Yeah.
It's funny because the dance song would have been something that in a sense, I wouldn't have skipped it, but I would have just read it quickly and been like, this is decoration. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? Because it's a song, like
Yeah. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
doesn't feel like it's weighty or important. But Lambert would argue that's precisely the point. Like Nietzsche's kind of burying his clues a little bit there.
Hmm.
Just a second.
I also like while you're looking for looking it
Hmm.
up, um, I kind of do try to play with this a little bit in my thesis that I'm saying like there's bits and pieces in Nietzsche that allow me to like basically interpret him in this
Hmm.
way. But it's not like clear cut. It's not like, you know, he doesn't say somewhere the big star, like, by the way, this is how I want to be read. It's more like you have to more or less read in between the lines, and they have like for instance that like I think one of the passages that is like about, you know, if you want to have like a strong convincing doctrine or teaching,
Hmm.
then it should be like, you know, a high tree that can conquer many storms. So
Yes.
really like, you know, that the mentor tells the students like, please just attack it from all sides, which is, by the way, also one reason why I actually appreciate like Jung and Girard and
Yes.
Heidegger, who are like in some sense fairly critical of like central tenets
Yes.
of Nietzsche, because like yeah, it invites that, right? Like it wants that too. Yeah.
And Nietzsche would want that. So yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
That's so
okay.
good.
So the dance song. So what should I just kind of go through this, or do you want me to?
Yeah, no, like it's really up to you. Like, so I know it's like it's about like let's say th 3 pages long. So it's like obviously we can read it completely, but maybe also focus on what you think is in the dance song that was particularly relevant to Lampert, and maybe whether like how you experienced that too. I'm
Okay.
curious.
So some context for listeners, and if you want to, you can certainly refer to my video as well. I've got everything timestamped, so you can go straight to the section. Um, but basically, the dance song is in the middle. It's right in the heart of part two of Zarathustra. And yep, exactly. And part two of Zarathustra. So there's, in Lampert's view, there's basically three parts to Zarathustra. There's technically four, but the fourth part was a little bit of an afterthought by Nietzsche. The version he wanted published in his lifetime was three parts. So there's three parts to Zarathustra. The first part is pretty much focuses on the Superman or the Übermensch. And he's going about preaching the Übermensch, basically. The meaning of the earth will be the Übermensch. Part two is a kind of transition, a really, really interesting transition. It focuses probably the most on a will to power, although will to power is not exactly mentioned much. It's always this kind of somewhat obscure doctrine, but it's a pivot point. And then part three is sort of centered on the eternal return, the idea that everything is going to happen exactly as it already has. And we might get into that later. But so we're here in the heart of part two, and this is the pivot point. And until this point, Lampert argues that Zarathustra, and therefore Nietzsche, because Zarathustra is in a sense a kind of avatar of Nietzsche, is basically an epistemological skeptic. So and this is one common reading of Nietzsche. If you take out certain things like a literal reading of eternal return or an insistence of will to power as being a description of reality, then what you're left with is a Nietzsche that's profoundly skeptical and always questioning and negating. And Lampert argues that here we have Nietzsche beginning to overcome that and move towards definitive ontology, precise, well, maybe precise is the wrong word, but at least a definite understanding of what being is. And so what happens in this chapter is that Zarathustra, well, we don't need to dwell on the setup too much, but basically what happens in the end is that he sings a song. And in this song, I'll just read the opening of the song. It's kind of humorous as well. First of all, though, he calls this a mocking song on the spirit of gravity. So the spirit of gravity is this figure in Zarathustra that can be interpreted in different ways, but certainly carries the connotation of like seriousness, or you could sort of see that as being aligned with like the religious sensibility, like, this is all a very serious affair.
Right.
Lampert links it to like tradition and to kind of rationality, but that's going too far afield. So anyway, this is a mocking song on the spirit of gravity. So the question we might have in the back of our minds is, well, who or what is the spirit of gravity in the song? So here's how it opens. Lately I looked into your eye, O life, and I seemed to sink into the unfathomable. But you pulled me out with a golden rod. You laughed mockingly when I called you unfathomable. All fish talk like that, you said. What they cannot fathom is unfathomable. But I am merely changeable and untamed, and in everything a woman, and no virtuous one. Although you men call me profound or faithful, eternal, mysterious, but you men always endow us with your own virtues. Ah, you virtuous men. Thus she laughed, the incredible woman, but I never believe her in her laughter when she speaks evil of herself. And so that's how it begins. So the first character here we see as life, and then it goes on to talk about a second character who Zarathustra also loves, who's called wisdom, his wild wisdom. And there's a kind of love triangle or something going on here. And so he loves them both, but he admits that he loves life more. In fact, he almost admits it to wisdom, because wisdom kind of reprimands him for loving life. And so they're very similar. And he actually says that. He says, the reason that I actually love wisdom is because she reminds me of life, which we can already begin to interpret, because that's a good description of wisdom. Wisdom, to be wisdom, has to be about reality. It has to be about existence or life. That's the purpose of wisdom. So you could see why they have that relation.
Great, yeah.
So one thing that Lampert picks up is so they're very similar in a lot of ways. Two ways that they're different, though, is that life talks about herself as being no virtuous woman. She does it in the same kind of breath that she's implying that she can be fathomed. That is to say, she can be possessed. She's not just some mysterious thing that you can never get to the bottom of, but she can actually be kind of had. Wisdom, on the other hand, is chaste. Wisdom is sort of like the traditional symbolism of wisdom, a woman who's, lofty, but can never be ravished, can never be possessed, kind of continually allures. And so Lampert fastens on this and sort of says, well, this is Nietzsche's epistemological skepticism. This is Nietzsche's wild wisdom, what he calls his wild wisdom, which is this idea that life can't be fathomed. What life offers him is the possibility of being fathomed. What he has to give up, though, is imposing his ideals on life. He has to actually expect to find something that might not at first sight be pleasing. So he says, I never believe her in her laughter when she speaks evil of herself. What's the evil that she's speaking of herself? Well, in a couple of chapters, it will become clear that life is essentially will to power. And so most people view that as something bad. And so this is life speaking evil of herself, but this is also life being grasped or being understood. And in Beyond Good and Evil, can't remember what number of the aphorism is, but there's a passage, I think it might be aphorism 36, where Nietzsche, and Beyond Good and Evil is the book that came after Zarathustra. And in a way, it's kind of doing similar things as Zarathustra, but in a negative way. But anyway, I think it's aphorism 36 and Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche kind of gives a strong explanation of will to power. Is that Beyond Good and Evil there? I'll just have a look at my book and see if I
yeah. So I think like at some point he does talk about will here. So he says will can of course operate only on will and not on matter.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. This is kind of the passage in Nietzsche, or one of the passages in Nietzsche, where he goes kind of all out with will to power and kind of suggests that it is, or at least could be, an explanation for everything, even like material, non-living things.
Yeah.
The very next aphorism, 37, he says, I'll just read it out. And he's the words I'm reading are sort of like a quote from him, of him quoting an imaginary interlocutor. So just bear that in mind. What does that, to speak vulgarly, not mean God is refuted, but the devil is not? And then Nietzsche replies, on the contrary, my friends, and who the devil compels you to speak vulgarly. So this is, Lampert sort of says, this is the natural reaction someone would have to this doctrine, that absolutely everything is will to power. There's no ethics in there. There's no purpose. There's just this constant sort of force or energy to expend itself, to overcome itself, to transform itself. And so someone who's sort of still immersed in a Judeo-Christian Platonic understanding would see that as, abolishing God, but the devil remains, the devil being the will to power. But Nietzsche's response is, on the contrary, my friends, which means that actually the real devil was the old God. And the real God is, well, what? And Lampert suggests maybe Dionysus, a different view of the world.
Right.
So back to the dance song, this is kind of where that pivot happens. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, okay. Yeah, I mean, I have things to say, but maybe you weren't finished yet. So
I was. I mean, I could go on forever, so I'll stop here and
yeah, but it is fascinating. I can slowly I think better and better hear what you find appealing about it. And I would say in me, but again, this is just an intuition, which is also why it's good that we're talking about this, is that I've noticed, let's say, things first of all in the development of what has come to be understood as God, but you can even look at, let's say, the some of the transcendentals in that way, that has developed over time in this way that, let's say, had to die in the Nietzschean sense. So I accept his criticism, but I only more or less accept his criticism on what it became and not so much on what it was. Whereas, Nietzsche would argue that already where it was, like if you look, for instance, slave morality, like where it started, it was already sort of
Hmm.
it had to fail in some sense. And I think that's something a little bit uncareful. That's, by the way, also one point I think that Girard points out, that he says, like, like he kind of makes it seem as if resentment is
Mm.
not just the child of the morality, but also the father. And it's like, well, he's
Yes.
wrong about that. Like, it might be the child of it, but it's not the father of this
Mm.
morality. It doesn't originally start it, but it is a consequence. Like, it has to be a consequence in some sense, that
Mm.
people will, affect this like inwardly, because they can no longer scapegoat as effectively anymore. But that's getting into details. What I'm thinking about when I'm listening to some of this, and what it means for God and affirming all of life, like all these things are sort of going through my head, and I want to just give one example of beauty, specifically of beauty as the one of the transcendental that I've discussed also, I think, with my brother in some videos. And earlier this year I've done a sort of a little public talk on like a genealogy of beauty,
Hmm.
which was named "Beauty is Dead and We Have Killed Her." Um, and it kind of like, because I kind of follow the same trajectory, that I more or less like I focus on how beauty has changed
Hmm.
throughout the, let's say, the millennia almost, and that you
Hmm.
can understand why that sense of beauty, where literally like you could just see, like David Hume at some point, he says like,
Hmm.
beauty is just a matter of taste. So to say that something is,
Hmm.
that something is truly beautiful is like saying, well, that is truly bitter, but this isn't. And like, so he more or less ridicules it almost,
Hmm.
beauty. Like that is like, he calls it a matter of taste. And if you
Hmm.
read Byung-Chul Han, who I can also really recommend, he kind of says like, it's telling that this sense of like, beauty as a matter of taste came about because taste is something that is fairly close. So maybe you could argue that if we have, like, let's say, a beautiful um dish, like just a
Hmm.
beautiful dinner, and you could taste it and it could taste beautiful. I guess that's conceivable. But one thing that is, let's say, a downside to that is that means that beauty is always experienced like right here. This is
Hmm.
just sort of like where
Hmm.
beauty is, like that's where the matter of taste happens. Whereas if we looked at like how people used to discuss beauty, it was really much more vision was
Hmm.
was was something that was much more relevant to it. So
Hmm.
beauty was something that was sculpturally relevant. So
Hmm.
we would look outward to like what was happening outside of
Hmm.
you. That would be beauty. And that's also why you see that it's something that actually challenges your,
Hmm.
let's say, egocentric perceptions.
Yes.
Whereas we see later on that when it becomes a matter of taste, it's like, well, yeah, I like this, but I don't really like that. Like you're not really focused on like, whoa, this is transforming me in this weird negative or positive way.
Yes,
And I
absolutely.
know,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
it's
mean,
it sounds like yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
there's an element of contemplation and vision that doesn't really work for taste. There's also an element of, what would you call it, like ingestion, assimilation in taste,
Right.
like assimilation to the ego. Yeah.
Exactly. Like you have to sort of make it your own,
Hmm.
and therefore no. So I totally agree, and that's why I understand why over the years beauty sort of more or less had to die. But if we look like back at really the time of like the ancient Greeks when they were discussing it, you see that beauty can be like it can be like shocking, and beauty can like devastate us, and
Yes.
it strikes us. And
Yes.
that's really when you're talking about that religious experience, like that's when I experience something as beautiful, when it's like, whoa, like, oh my God,
Yes.
like this is it's rocking my world in some sense.
Yes.
Um, okay, this is like a tangent, but I'll say the reason why I think it's relevant is that Nietzsche makes a lot about sort of, like he has this it's feminine, like it's a woman, like he
Yes.
used these stereotypes to or like archetypes, and I don't know, like, or symbolisms, like, to talk about some of these categories. And he also says like, like the it becomes Christian, it becomes female, it becomes feminine. He kind of
Yes.
says that in How the Earth Finally Became a Fable. And I'm saying, like, for instance, with beauty, you can genuinely see that. So, like, when at some point, I think Edmund Burke, he more or less splits up an understanding of both, like, let's say, the beautiful, which is the feminine. So it's like it
Hmm.
doesn't challenge you. It's like
Hmm.
it's calming, it's pleasing. You
Hmm.
can see how all those
Hmm.
stereotypes get there about the feminine,
Hmm.
wh- which is, by the way, also not true. Like, if you also know feminine symbolism, that can be like dreadful. It can be like obviously very terrifying.
Hmm.
Just to speak of the Medusa, for instance, like that would be
Hmm.
one. example. But that was how Burke characterized it. And then on the other hand, you have the sublime, which is like the more masculine, which is like that's also
Hmm.
beautiful. We don't really talk about the sublime as much anymore, so we only talk about beauty. So you
Hmm.
only have that remaining sense of like, well, it's pleasing, and you
Hmm.
know, like,
Hmm.
and you have that. It's a sense of taste. Like that's also something that
Hmm.
Burke introduces. And the reason why I think that's relevant is because what I feel Nietzsche really rejects is what some of these categories have become. And
Hmm.
that's where I totally follow him, where it's like, okay, you know, like we need to be critical of this really one-dimensional, one-sided view of some of these notions that we have. So for instance, God, so for instance, compassion. So for instance, like because compassion might now be a little bit more filled with resentful than it might have
Yes.
originally been in when for instance Jesus acted out, which Nietzsche, by the way, is also open about in the Antichrist, that he says like, well, actually, he was genuinely without resentment
Yes.
when he
Yes.
was
Exactly.
compassionate.
Yeah.
And that's really where I struggle with some of this, that I want the opponent processing to come back in, where I'm like, okay, and this is the Nietzschean perspective, and it's great. And then I want to sort of say like, okay, so Nietzsche helps us to revive some of those ancient notions that have more or less just completely, you know, been watered down to something that is just untenable. But I do want it to come back into the discussion, if you know
What
what I mean. So I'm
what
curious how you look at that. Yeah.
I want to look maybe more directly at opponent processes in a moment, because we talked about that a little bit in the first video. I wanted to sort of circle back to that and see what more you have to kind of say about that idea of Dionysus versus the crucified being opponent processes. But what you were just talking about, I mean, I resonate with that a lot. It makes a lot of sense. And you actually see kind of an example of this maybe in Zarathustra, in the sense that in the second dance song, so this is at the end of part 3, when he's willed the eternal return and redeemed himself and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of a metaphorical depiction of that. He dances with the woman life, but he don't, I mean, he doesn't dance with her. It's a kind of chase. He hunts her. But she has the Medusa. She has the Medusa snakes in her hair. So it's interesting you mentioned that. And
Oh, that's good.
she's
Great.
clearly not simply prettiness. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
she's dangerous. She's dangerous, and she's kind of nature or woman. I mean, essentially she's nature, but
Mm.
using woman as a metaphor in her fullness. And
Well, like, but sorry, I like this really reminds me like that's kind
mm,
of why I've sort of like I've I've started appreciating the Platonic vision again,
mhm.
incorporating, let's say, the Nietzschean criticism of the Platonic criticism, because it would be like, you know, like we live in the world of appearance, but the
Hmm.
appearance is like, you know, like they don't matter. It's about the eternal forms behind it. But if you can also read Plato in a specific way, where it's like, well, actually, like that completely fuels everything we see. So everything is like is like a symbolic like gate to like this huge world, and
Yes.
everything is part of it. So it's not like, oh, you know, like you should reject it, which is also why, for instance, in the symposium, when they talk about beauty there, it's like you should
Mm.
start with
Yes.
loving beautiful bodies, and then you
Yes.
could see that as a ladder. So not to say like, oh, bodies are bad, but only
Yes.
appreciate the beautiful. Like, no, it works that way, and it scales up and back down, because when
Yes.
you go out of the cave, you have to go back into the cave. So
Yes.
just wanted to mention that too. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Part of what I'm sort of going to be thinking about moving forward, and maybe engaging more with Viveki because of this, is is there in what sense is a kind of Platonic view compatible with a kind of Nietzschean immanent view? Um,
Mm.
and because I think Viveki kind of almost not explicitly, but very close to explicitly is trying to do that. So what I mean by that is, what sense is there in talking about like the transcendent in a way that doesn't replace the immanent or displace the immanent? Um,
Yeah.
and that a lot of that does seem potentially compatible with a kind of Nietzschean insistence on immanence. Um, Nietzsche himself, it seems like he kind of had a very anti-Platonist view, even of mathematics and so forth. Like everything's just an abstraction from becoming. But I think the key thing for Nietzsche is that the transcendent isn't a replacement for the immanent. And so that's why, but that's to me a kind of fundamental problem or barrier to kind of fully embracing a Christian worldview, because frankly, a Christian worldview looks forward to that replacement in the sense of the the last day, the resurrection of the dead, and
Yeah.
that seems just untenable to me. I
Yeah.
don't know how to imagine that. It doesn't seem to make sense to me. Like,
Well,
so yeah.
I would say maybe one way of possibly interpreting that is that what you want is you want, let's say, a part of the story, whatever that is. It could be your life, it could be, let's say, humanity, whatever,
Mm,
that retrospectively allows you to love all of it, if that makes sense. And that's how I would combine the two. It's like that's how you would have both Nietzsche and Plato in one. It's like, or Christ and
hmm
Nietzsche.
hmm
It's like you have those moments where all of a sudden, like, oh, I needed this. So you've kind of been living towards it, but
Yes.
by experiencing that, you actually see, like, it's not like, oh, we used to be awful. It's like, it's almost like, in the Christian way, you might feel like profound compassion for yourself. You might be like, oh, I was worrying about, like, so much. Like, I was worried that, things were not going to turn out right. And now I see, like, it all makes sense. And you kind of have those twists in many of those stories where it's like something happens that redeems the whole story before that. And it's not like a simple twist, like,
Yes.
oh, spoiler alert, like, if you hear it, like, actually it will just devalue the whole story. Because I
Yes.
agree, that would be problematic. Then it would be like, oh, it's just basically about this. And I think, like, Nietzsche has, by the way, um he has one very beautiful aphorism that relates to sort of this, what I'm trying to explain. He says, like, okay, there's a difference between the goal of something, I think, um and the end. So he says, like, okay, when a melody has not yet reached, oh yeah, so like the end of a melody is not the goal of a melody. Like, it's not like you just listen to the melody
Yes.
to get to it.
Yeah.
But he also said, like, before you've gotten to the end, you haven't gotten the goal of the melody. And I
Yes.
think that I would interpret it in that way. Like, if you have that, like, it's not all for the sake of, let's say, the afterlife, because I totally agree that would be like just a complete like devaluation of this life. But I would say that sometimes that can really help to see the whole in perspective, that allows you to love it eternally recurring, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it certainly does to an extent. I mean, so
Mm.
the Nietzschean ideal, at least as I take it from Lampert, is maybe similar to that, right? Which is affirm the eternal return, affirm your imminent life as it is. How does one
Mhm.
come to do that? Well, one has to have a certain disposition to life in a way that they can affirm it. That means to say that they have to both be open to it in a certain way, but it also means they have to actively live in a certain way. They have to actually do the things that make life fulfilling, and be the kind of person that makes life feel worthwhile. But there seems to be a point that you can get to potentially where you could actually make that affirmation. It seems like Nietzsche himself made that affirmation. It's beautifully tragic as well because, Nietzsche made that, if Nietzsche made that affirmation, which seems likely, um, what he's essentially affirming is no matter what happens, I want my life to be lived again. Of course, what actually happens is however long it was it 10 years of insanity, something like that?
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Which is just it's the worst, most tragic ending for Nietzsche. It's something I think he probably would have found to be, much worse than just like
mm,
a painful death, but a quick one.
yeah.
And yet
I know.
the question in the back of my mind is, would he still have affirmed it? I mean, it's really interesting. His life is his whole life, but at the same time, there is maybe a point in his life or a period in his life where he feels like it justifies the whole thing. Um,
Yeah,
so that, I
yeah,
mean, I think that's a beautiful vision. Now, how compatible that is with the Christian vision, I'm not too sure. Um, I'll propose a theory which I've been thinking about, which is that maybe but it's it's a theory that might not be well received by the religious listeners, but there we go. It seems to me that if you do believe in an afterlife, that relieves a lot of anxiety about death, and it actually relieves a lot of tension. You don't actually have to worry about death anymore. It frees you up to actually just appreciate life. for instance, if you're looking forward to something really wonderful within life, the things that happen up until that point, so long as they don't endanger it, you kind of, you have a kind of jolliness about you. You kind of have an openness and acceptingness. Oh, this bad thing happened, but it was minor. It doesn't matter because I'm going to whatever, get married soon or whatever it might be. And so it feels like that would apply if you believe that you are going to live eternally with God or something like that.
Yeah.
It seems it's an open question, but it seems like that might have a similar effect to doing the Nietzschean move of affirming the eternal return, because you're available, you've been freed up to actually just live life, live the immanent life that you live. What do you think about that?
So let me just reiterate it because I'm not sure if I'm completely following, and
Hmm.
then you could say whether or not it's correct. So it's
Hmm.
like you think that this vision of actually like say, having this afterlife that you look forward to, it actually allows you to, let's say, feel a lot, let's say, less bad about some of these negative things that happen in life, because you're just like, no, it's like, as long as it doesn't endanger the afterlife, it actually, you can fully affirm the whole of life because it leads up to that. Is that more or less
It's
getting at
very
it? Or not?
close. Yeah, it's very close. I'm sort of fleshing it out as I speak, so I'm probably not
Yeah, no,
conveying it very
absolutely.
well.
Yeah,
But there's a sense in which it's in a sense in which the bad things in life, they don't really matter, I guess, because they're
yeah,
not going to prevent you from getting to that truly wonderful thing. And
yeah,
because they don't really matter, you can be open to them and experience them in a different way, in a way where they're not all or nothing, where they're not completely destructive, but in a way that they're just part of life, just something that you're
right.
passing through. You can appreciate them
Oh,
better, is what I'm suggesting.
yes. So I would also say, like, let's say I've been I just went like hiking in
Hmm.
Slovenia, which was really
Hmm.
fun. And I was reminded again, because I don't hike all the time, like the Netherlands is a very flat country.
Hmm.
I was reminded again um, how wonderful it can be to, like, not just, let's say, drive up to a view and then experience the view, which is really nice, and then you drive back. And it's like, in
Hmm.
some sense, like, there's less suffering involved. Whereas,
Yes.
if you go hiking, like, there's just moments during that hike where you're just dreading it, where it's just like,
Yes.
fuck, I want it to be
Yes.
over. It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
and at the same point, at the same time, and that's kind of also what I mean with that point leading up to it. It's not just like, I guess that didn't really matter. It's almost like that adds to, like, let's say, your experience of the view when you're on top of that mountain. And I'm
Absolutely.
not saying it's just about the experience, and that we're all experience machines and we're all in this Cartesian frame. Like I like, it could be something else. It could also be leading up to, let's say, for instance, well, yeah, like it could be leading up to a wedding. So like everything that all the annoying things that go into organizing a wedding, that
Hmm.
eventually, like, you have this wonderful communal ritual that is
Hmm.
like, whoa, sort of affirms everything that was also difficult about this time leading up to it.
Absolutely.
And that's like
Yeah.
not just about organizing the wedding, it's also about organizing the relationship that's obviously
Yes.
central in in the wedding. So I would kind of say, like, it's not just like, oh, I guess the bad doesn't matter anymore. It's like, no, it's like that was relevant to now appreciate even more strongly, like, how much it has formed me. Like,
Exactly.
it's just like with the hike, like, like those, like, it requires some character to go
Ex
through those moments as well, and not just go back down the mountain, but actually, like, no, I'm gonna go through this and then eventually go up this. And that is also an affirmation of sorts, right?
Exactly. And on a thing like a hike, or perhaps even preparing for a wedding, it's you actively want that in a way, because you want to I mean, let's take the hike example. Like if you're choosing to go on a hike and you could just drive up the mountain, then you understand that there's something intrinsically rewarding about exerting that
Mhm.
effort and even experiencing that suffering, and that it's
Yeah,
part of a whole experience, which is going to include the view from the top, which is going to include the self overcoming, self conquest that it involves, that the pain itself is going to be experienced in some sense, at least in retrospect, if not in the moment, as being valuable in itself. But this to me
Mhm.
just seems all very Nietzschean. I think this is why it resonates with me, because
Well, it's
he's
also like, obviously all the hiking metaphors are very
and of
Nietzschean.
course they are, because that's how he lived. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so what I'm suggesting is perhaps that having a confident view in the afterlife frees you, sort of allows you to get into a state where you can do that more readily, My hesitation with the afterlife view would be like the afterlife itself and how seriously you can take it. Because what's the afterlife? The afterlife is an eternal existence of not having that struggle and suffering. So, like,
Well,
where
okay,
does life go then?
if you ask me, like the
Yeah.
afterlife is something that we can speculate about. Like we can
Mm,
speculate about what happens when we die, but to me, that's like it's so difficult to say something concrete about what it would look like. It's like even the notion of time, right? Like time for us, it's like it's very much bound to, let's say, earthly existence. So to even imagine what, without time, like what that would look like, it's just like so even if I would entertain, let's say, the traditional notions of the afterlife, I'm like, okay, yeah, but I can't fathom it. It's like it's not really something that I can honestly, consciously even like. But I would say you can have some glimpses of those timeless moments in your own life when you kind of feel like, okay, maybe that could be an intimation of
mhm,
what that could be like. But at the same time, I'm so not confident about that being the case that I kind of feel like, okay, it might be, let's say, like you're hiking up the mountain and you don't know what the view will be like, but you know there will be, like, let's say, an endpoint, and either it will be, let's say, an endpoint where you briefly see the road you've walked and you're kind of like fairly happy with that, if that makes sense.
mm,
Or like you'll be looking out like over like this huge span of earth that you weren't able to see before, and now you can sort of retrospectively see even more than just the road you've walked. You see like very clearly over everything else. That would kind of also be a vision of, let's say, an afterlife where it's like, oh, you see so much more and you see it like
mhm,
contextualized in the whole. Um, and I think both of those are in some sense possible. But to me, I agree with some of your criticism of the afterlife, which is why I don't like to talk about it. But I also don't like assuming that there's nothing after we die. I'm kind of like in this in between space
yeah.
where, and I kind of said that one thing that I liked, what Bernardo Kastrup does with his philosophical thesis, like on metaphysical idealism, is he kind of has this way of at least making it compelling that it's at least not unlikely that something like an afterlife would exist, but it would be very different from what you might assume it to be. Because obviously, like, what would like my like now you're looking at, let's say, my empirical self, but I
Mhm,
also experience my empirical self all the time. So it'd be
mhm,
very difficult for me to say like, oh, like how would my empirical self be sort of, you know, transformed or transported into the afterlife, or what would remain? Like, what is that soul
yes.
besides everything that I've experienced in this world? And that's
Yeah.
so incredibly difficult that I kind of like that solution of his, where it's like, no, it's kind of like emerging with, let's say, the
Mm,
collective consciousness that is way larger than all of our ego consciousnesses combined, if that makes sense.
yeah.
But
Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, that also that view resonates with me as well, more so than the sort of individual, continued individual existence view, a kind of merging with the absolute.
And by the way, just to add a little bit
Hmm.
to what makes it less sad, because some people will be sad by that because they would want to, for instance, like they would want to see, for instance, their parents again,
Yes.
something like that. They
Yes.
would want to be reunited with them in the like, oh, I'm Aaron and you're
Yes.
my dad, you're my
Yes.
mom, kind of that
Yes.
sense. But what I liked about it is like he says it's really similar to waking up from a dream. It's like you might still remember the dream, and the dream was maybe even wonderful, but you know that was part of you, but you don't feel sad like, oh my God, my dream character died. Like you don't feel like that kind of sadness. Like, no, how do I go on living? My dream character died. You're like, wow, that was a really wonderful and weird and trippy and confronting, but beautiful and tragic, but like in all those sort of affirmative senses life. And wow, now I can see the whole of it, and now I can experience those relationships with my father. But then you would be that same consciousness where, like, let's say, to which, for instance, your parents' consciousness
You
would
would,
merge. And
yeah.
again, it's all very
Exactly.
speculative.
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is definitely happening. I'm just
You
saying,
you wouldn't
like,
get to just meet your deceased parents. You would get to be your deceased parents as well. So
yeah.
one could argue that's a more, well, depending on one's perspective, one could argue that's a better thing or a worse thing. But
Yeah, I
anyway,
guess it depends, right? Like because if you grow up, you kind of have the same that you feel that at some point you become like a different personality or more solidified personality, and you kind of still have part of that child who you were. So it's not like
Hmm.
you lose that, but you kind of feel that it's integrated into the whole, and you don't feel like that's a bad thing. It's like, whoa, I'm actually happy that I've had those experiences that now form me to where I've been. But then you might have been like, whoa, a whole person is in here, and then another person is in here, and you kind of experience all of that.
And
But
you're the only self in existence. I mean, there's something. I mean, I think actually that Nietzsche can be combined quite well with a kind of Hindu monist
mm,
view, very well
yeah,
actually.
mm,
He basically speaks like this, although of course he's being metaphorical, but he kind of just speaks like this in Zarathustra and in other books.
mm,
But when in Zarathustra, for instance, when life in it's a couple of chapters on self-overcoming, a couple of chapters after the dance song, when he says he's got the secret from life, and life says, let me just jump to the chapter so I can quote what she says.
is it the last dance song or the first one?
It's just a couple of chapters after the first dance song. So on
Oh yeah,
self-overcoming, chapter
yeah,
12, although the translation we have doesn't number the chapters.
yeah.
And life itself told me the secret. Behold, it said, I am that which must overcome itself again and again. Um, I would rather perish than renounce this one thing. And truly, where there is perishing and the falling of leaves, behold, their life sacrifices itself for the sake of power. Um, whatever I create and however much I love it, soon I have to oppose it and my love. Thus my will have it, etc., etc. This is basically the Hindu view of Shakti. This is
Mm,
basically Shakti and the will to power are very similar. Shakti is basically energy. It's also the feminine aspect of God. Um,
mm,
it's the power that keeps the apparent universe in existence. Uh, so it can be combined really nicely, I think, with a kind of Hindu view. Um,
yeah.
you would just say that Nietzsche doesn't talk about Brahman. He only focuses on Shakti, Brahman being the transcendent one subject, one consciousness. Um,
Mm,
the problem that many people have with the Hindu view, well, it's not the Hindu view, but let's say the monist Hindu view, is that there's no room for real love in the sense
yeah,
that there's only one subject. How much of that a problem? How much of that is a problem? I don't know, but that's the objection: is that there's no space for genuine relationship. There's only space for illusory relationships.
yeah. I tend to agree, which is obviously that might be my Christian sort of haunting me.
Mm,
But like that's kind of why I said like, okay, you can speculate about the afterlife, but it's really not something that I'm gonna make any claims about.
mhm,
And the claim could be, for instance, that it would look like, let's say, that Hindu picture that we described,
mhm,
but it could also be different. So what
mhm,
I'm then committed to is like how to live an earthly life, and that would
mhm.
also, by the way, I think be a very Nietzschean like you know sentiment to be like, how do I actually affirm this life and not in light of the afterlife? And then I do come back to, let's say, this understanding of love in the, let's say, uh, resentment free sense, because I can now understand, because of Nietzsche, that's how I what I mean a little bit with the opponent processing, how love can be somewhat filled with resentful, like, oh, we would just love it if everyone was equal, for instance, like,
Yes,
oh, that would be wonderful, but like that could mask actually a deep
yes,
hate,
yeah.
like something more powerful of you. So I'm wary of that, and I kind of, and at the same time I also like, like I think Nietzsche is also at this very difficult point, which is also why it's difficult to be a Nietzschean. It's like you want to affirm all of life, and therefore affirm it in some sense as it is. But you also know that Nietzsche, for instance, like he spent his whole life trying to, in some sense, change the world. Like not in the
Yes,
Marxist sense, not in the collectivist sense,
yes,
but still there be have like a strong influence on it. So in some sense, he doesn't affirm it, because if he completely affirmed, he would just be happy and not write anything, and then would be okay with it, or he would write his books for himself, and that would be okay. But
if
he also found it very important
mm,
to be able to change that world, and that nonetheless shows, and this is something that Jonathan Peugeot sometimes talks about as well, is like that everyone has this intuition of the fall in the general sense, that there's something about our existence which calls to us. That's like the theodicy aspect, by the way,
mhm,
that I also
mhm,
that's in my thesis. Like it calls to us like that life could be better, that there's something about this life. And that's strange. Like I understand that sounds un-Nietzschean of me to say, but that there's something about this life which is broken, which needs redemption. But like that's his whole project, is to be like, well, actually, I find it deeply like I feel so sorry for, like, that's the pity of Zarathustra as well, right? Like I feel so sorry for the condition of humanity, and I want to help them. And that's also why I argue that he felt so lonely in the end, that he didn't feel understood, that he actually wanted to help humanity, and that he didn't just, like
Mm,
that also is part of it. But that is, I think, like a profoundly, I'm not sure if it's a Christian intuition or just like an intuition of, let's say, a reality as it is.
mhm.
Um, but it has this Christian twist that is more than just a Hindu twist, because he's like, let's get involved, like let's really, like, talk to each other and do something about this, and bring this about, as opposed to be like, like the Buddhist solution, for instance, that he criticizes, obviously a very superficial
Yes.
understanding of
Yeah, yeah.
Buddhism, but still, like that he's like, yeah, we're not just gonna disintegrate, like we're gonna um that's something that Vervaeke also emphasized. Like we've lost something in this appreciation of religion, which is also his criticism of Schopenhauer, right? It's like
Yes.
we've lost the sense that actually you can break through to like really value life in this strong sense, and maybe also that religious experience you had while reading it. I'm really curious again to hear more about that, but
Well,
that's private.
I was being too what would you say? I was using a bit of hyperbole, I think. I didn't have any vision or anything like that, but you know what I mean. What I mean by religious experience is that it felt transformative. Let's just say that. It felt transformative. I actually feel more joy um after having read
Okay.
Zarathustra
Yeah.
through Lampert's lens. I feel more joy, I feel more acceptance of life as it is. Um,
Yeah.
I feel more appreciation for life. I kind of I have more of a sense of what he might mean by like a tragic aesthetic sense of existence. So in that sense, it felt religious. Also, the language is so poetic and compelling. Also, to come back to that point that I said we'll come back to about, is it like the Bible in that it has multiple layers of meaning? I mean, yes, it does, and I think that Nietzsche, maybe in addition to channeling archetypal contents, did also consciously construct it to have multiple layers, and
Mm.
um, maybe because he wanted to construct it as a kind of quasi-religious text, because I think it does have those layers, and it has little hints within it, within the book Zarathustra, like the chapter on reading and writing, where he's talking about the nature of aphorisms and, aphorisms
Mm.
being peaks demanding readers with long legs and the whole thing is composed of aphorisms. And he gives you little hints as to the kind of reader he wants. And he gives little hints that he's hiding something. Um, and he gives little hints by what he does mention and what he doesn't mention. For instance, when he uses the term will to power, all at very critical points, meaningful points, and other points
Mm.
where he could have used the term, he chooses not to, particularly when he's speaking to audiences. So, like there's all this stuff going on in the
Yeah.
book, and I think that lends a sort of religious experience. It's a similar experience to having Peugeot kind of dig into a biblical story or something like that, as
Oh yeah,
having
yeah, yeah.
Lampert dig into Nietzsche.
Something is revealed to you. Yeah, like, but that's by the way, I think in general, like it's
Mm,
this whole book, and I was reminded of that again when I kind of revisited Jung's interpretation of it. Like it is a gem in some sorts, because it's like a famous book. Like it's like
mhm,
people know about it. Like
mhm.
as you like, I think I should fact check this, but what I heard, by the way, is that the German Nazi soldiers, like that they were carrying both a copy of Thus Spoke Zarathustra and the
Yes.
Bible with them, which I
Yes, I
thought was
had that too.
hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'm not sure if that's true, but I find that really fascinating. But so it's like it's not like this obscure text that no one knows about. So it's like a cultural event in some sense,
Hmm.
and that's important because that is rare. Like that, the fact that like this was written in the 19th century, but it has some of those qualities that would maybe also, if Lampert is correct here, like split history in two, like actually
Hmm.
maybe be relevant, let's say 1,000 years from now. It could potentially have that, but at the same time, like I also do agree a little bit with Jung that like he says that some parts are actually written well, and it seems like he's doing extremely well to allow, let's say, the intuitive side of himself to show up and write some of this work. And other parts feel a little bit more forced, where he's like, okay, no, now I just want to tell you what I think. And
Yeah.
and I think that that's also fine. I would say this is very difficult. And I already, like, if you just look at, how many years he spent writing the books, that it's clear that like this was very monumental for him. But at the same time, he was, I don't know, like how old must he have been? Like about 39, I think, when he wrote this. Something like that. Not entirely sure. But so it's not like so old that you can imagine like, okay, now he's really condensing
Yes.
all of his life sort of like wisdom and philosophy into this
Yes.
final work. It was actually relatively young. I mean, obviously, like I think both of us are younger than that.
Yes.
But yes, so maybe we can't really tell. But I think that that's all relevant. That even though this is like that makes me value this book very deeply, even though I still don't dare say that I understand it, and maybe I should read the Lampert analysis for that and the approach. But I'm
Let's
just fascinated by. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
well, you brought up Jung. So you had mentioned to me three thinkers that have different perspectives on
Yeah.
the book. And Jung was one of them, and you kind of hinted at his perspective already. But how would you describe Jung's perspective of Zarathustra?
So for Jung, Zarathustra himself is like a wise old man archetype that Nietzsche more or less, like he revives. And by the way, there's also some interesting potential inconsistencies that we could point out. So like Nietzsche says, God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. But at the same time, he wants to revive Dionysius
Yes.
and
Yeah.
Zarathustra, which is very interesting. It's like, why don't they remain dead? And
Yes.
that's also that I think that kind of helps me to think that maybe the God he's talking about is maybe not the God, like and like let's say, yeah, God, capital G. I don't know how one would say it, but let's say I understand that, let's say, the 19th century understanding of God has died. I
Yes.
totally agree, but I don't think necessarily, and this is also a point that Paul Tillich makes, like there could be maybe a God beyond God that nonetheless lives on, or lives for the first time, maybe even. It's very difficult to answer these types of questions. So you could say that what Jung is focused on is that Nietzsche took it upon himself to really deeply, like more so than, like obviously way more so than the atheists of his time, to think through consciously the death of God. Like he really, like, okay, what does that actually mean? And he radically accepted those conclusions of what it would mean. That would be the case according to Jung. But then he would use Dionysian and Zarathustra to kind of more or less come in as alternatives. But if you do that, like, then that lends itself fairly easily to ego inflation, because it's not like, let's say, like, if we both still have, like, even if, like, let's say both of us are like atheists, or whoever might be listening to this and is an atheist, according to Jung, you would still have a very deep inner understanding of that God is actually still very much present in many ways, like that he actually has a clear function in your life. And you could say then, if you nonetheless, like Nietzsche, think through actually, like, deeply, not just intellectually, like God can't exist because X, but also like, no, what would that mean, and how could that even be true in some sense? Then the archetypes that you invite in to say, like, well, this could maybe be a substitute for that, they become like massive, because like God was massive, right? Like it was so massive that it had a huge influence on everything, that now we don't know the extent to which we are still moved by that same God in some sense, to, even if we don't believe in this God. And that's the thing, like I think Nietzsche did get very close to actually rejecting that God, and therefore allowing himself to become somewhat insane
Yes.
by introducing Zarathustra and Dionysius. That would obviously, like, I understand this is a bit annoying to bring up the general criticism, like, oh, Nietzsche went insane, so therefore incorrect. But I do think this is a little bit more in depth, in a certain way, that you can tell that it's not always clear, like, is Nietzsche identifying himself as Zarathustra? And in some passages it seems like he is, and in other passages it seems like he isn't. But that's very it's something you should be, let's say, a little bit more careful with. Just like none of us, or some do, but they can go crazy, none of us easily identify ourselves with God. Like it's like, well, careful
Mm.
there. Like you
Mm-hmm.
aren't, you know. So I'm curious how you look at that, just like as a main picture. Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting. Like I've read a lot of Jung. I used to be much more into Jung. It had a sort of basically Jungian worldview. Funnily enough, because I was talking about before how sort of like a non-dual, a monist Hindu view can go quite nicely with Nietzscheanism. I think that the Jungian view can actually sit in that mix quite well as well.
Yeah.
That was kind of my view for a long time, I think. But with so where was it going with this? So we've got ego inflation,
Yeah.
Jung, Nietzsche.
Nietzsche going insane. Yeah. And then also identifying yourself with God, Nietzsche identifying himself as Zarathustra.
Yes, 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 that's right, that's right. So I'm inclined to give some credit to the idea of synchronicity. I'm inclined to see that as being something going on there. Um, and that's not necessarily me saying that the transcendent exists, because, within the immanent realm of physics, there's things like entanglement and so forth. But
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but it seems
Which
like
Jung, by the way, also considered to be synchronicities. So that's
right,
just
exactly. Yeah. So, even the physical world is much more strange than we think. So, if you give credit to the idea of synchronicity, I think that certain people um, act out archetypal stories or attract archetypal stories, or symbolism to themselves. I found it really striking, for instance, when John Peterson went through all that terrible suffering and misfortune, and himself and his family. um like it was like he was being crucified in a way, and it was funny because that was he was essentially identifying with the archetype of Christ, because he wasn't a believing Christian. He couldn't kind of externalize that archetype. His whole thing was internalize the archetype, carry your cross. um on top of that, he was influencing thousands and thousands of people all over the world.
yeah.
um and so I feel like he kind of, in a way, maybe, I'm not saying this definitely happened, but one way to interpret that is that there was archetypal energies at play, and there was a kind of synchronicity that said that you kind of have to suffer the story in a way. I think
Mm.
you could argue something similar might have happened with Nietzsche, in the sense that um, somewhere or other, it's probably in Zarathustra itself, but there's some reference to, like, the founders have to be crucified. The first people who come have to be, if not crucified, then killed, or um,
Yeah.
something like that, persecuted. Um, and so,
Right.
and that is archetypal. Like, even Girard would agree with that, although it'd have a different spin on it, because the god to be would be killed by the community, but still there would be a sacrifice that begins that new deity, the new epoch. And
Mm.
one has to wonder if Nietzsche um, just had to be that sacrifice, assuming you give credit to Lampert that he's instigating a new epoch, or even if you don't, you could just say that his aims, his goals, his ambition, and his abilities meant that he was going to draw that fate on himself. And of course, Dionysus is the god of madness, as well as all the other things he's the god of. So it is a very strange fate that the
Yeah.
person bringing back the god of madness would go mad. Uh,
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
same time, I don't want to go too strong on this, because I do find it, like, slightly annoying, because I was reading that Girard essay today, and I do find it slightly annoying, because the fact that he went mad is just it's just too easy to project on it, especially if
Yeah.
you're against Nietzsche, and say, okay, well, this is why he went mad. You know what I mean? Like, and it could just be because something was wrong with his brain. Like, his vision
Yeah.
was deteriorating. He was having migraines. It's not like it was just purely psychological.
Yeah, but I guess you could argue like that's always like a difficult interplay, because it could be like that thing that was wrong with his brain allowed him to have these thoughts in the first
Exactly.
place, but then
Exactly.
that further accelerated the process. So it's like so you don't really like it's it's difficult to just say like these are completely dissociated, and like it doesn't matter what he would have done, he would have and turned out insane in some sense, anyways.
On
But I
that
guess like what?
note, so sorry.
Mhm.
Oh, just one more thing, but don't
Yeah,
lose what
no,
you were
go
going
ahead.
to
Yeah.
say, because Jung himself explicitly applies this thing that I've just talked about to Jesus himself as a historical figure. He
Mhm.
says that Jesus himself, because he acted out the archetype so well, caused his own fate, like caused his crucifixion. Like he had to live it out. Um,
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah.
an interesting idea.
By the way, in some sense, I do agree because I remember like that, like I once heard like the counter argument that it was like, okay, but Jesus, like, couldn't he just stayed alive and just save the world? Like, because after that,
Yeah,
so many, like, it's like, okay, well, you could also say that it was like almost like his inner necessity, like, like that once you live an archetype, and that's, Jung also mentions that it's like when people become sort of whether they have an archetypal experience, they actually act very expectedly. That is like, okay, well, this totally fits the archetype, obviously. Like
exactly.
when they have
Yeah.
experience, like, and it does seem like you could apply that to someone like Christ as well, and maybe to Nietzsche too. And that could like it could also be um a warning a little bit. And by the way, I wouldn't just like include Dionysius. I would also include Heraclitus, like that notion of reality as constantly becoming.
Yeah.
Whereas I think I prefer the notion of being and becoming, being in opponent, thing, let's say, but of just becoming, like at the almost at the expense of being, you might say. That's like, well, what is there left of any identity then? Like just so identity is something that is being amidst becoming. But if
Mm.
if you fully embrace becoming at the expense, if I can say it that way, like of being, then you can understand why Nietzsche also went insane. And I'm not, again, I know that that's projecting, but that why he maybe lost who he himself was in some sense.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I also think that one reason why I like the Girardian analysis, because I want to account for the fact why the crucified obviously came back in his Waanbriefen,
Hmm.
why you see some of those notes
Hmm.
later on in his life, that it's almost like, he went completely the Dionysian route, more or less, slowly. It's like,
Hmm.
he started Dionysus versus Apollo, but then it does come back, like the crucified comes back,
It
even though he
does.
thought he dispensed with that. It's like, and that's almost to say that we've entered a new epoch that we can't dispense with. It's like, and that's by the way, and Girard isn't fully even embracing that. Like he's very well aware of all the risks that like a Christian epoch brings with it. It's like because all of a sudden, like that effective scapegoat mechanism that was still there in the Dionysian rites is all of a sudden no longer available in itself by us because we're so influenced by some
Mm.
of these Christian understandings of sacrifice that we can no longer just simply say like, well, actually we're going to reject all that and just go to the Dionysian. So we have to understand like what it means to be a victim, what it means to sacrifice, at least partially in that Christian sense. Like it's like it's almost yeah, we can't do without that.
Well, you've
Uh,
bridged really nicely into the next thinker I want to talk about, which is Girard.
oh, great.
So yeah, yeah. So you'd
And by the
like
way, I should mention, unfortunately, like I do have to leave in like about let's say 10-15 minutes, but I
mm,
just wanted to yes.
okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we
Yeah.
could make this a two-part thing. What do you
I
think?
love that. I love that. I love that.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Because I think there's lots we could continue to talk about.
Yeah.
So let's just end on Girard. And if we don't get too far into it, we can just come back to it
Yeah.
next time. So I
And I
read,
can talk about Heidegger also next time.
yes, Heidegger will have to be a next time for sure.
Yeah.
Um, so I read Girard's essay. I think it was from like 1986, something around then. Um, Dionysus versus the Crucified. Um,
Hmm.
and it's got some insights. I liked it. I've read not much Girard at all. I haven't read any of his books. I think I've read like a couple of his articles. I wrote a sort of essay thing on Hamlet, interpreting Hamlet, and kind of opposed his interpretation of Hamlet because I felt like it wasn't true to the text. But in any case,
Quite
so
interesting.
Girard, um, Girard is arguing. If I got the quote here, I'll just see if I can. Well, actually, I'm afraid to do anything to my computer just in case it messes with the recording. But there's
Can you
this
like
there's this
remind me
quote.
and then I might figure out loud. Yeah.
So it's this quote. I think you included in your thesis as well. It's this
Yeah.
quote that contrasts Jesus with Dionysus and sort of says that their martyrdom was similar.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I
And
remember.
and it's that different conception of the different martyrdoms,
And do you
which
mean, by the way, the Nietzsche quote that that he
yes,
seems
the
to refer?
Nietzsche quote, yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Do you want me to quickly read it or not?
yes, yes, absolutely. If you've got it there, yeah.
So this is indeed like this is by Nietzsche himself. Dionysus versus the crucified. There you have the antithesis. It is not a difference in regard to their martyrdom. It is a difference in the meaning of it. Life itself, its eternal fruitfulness and recurrence, creates torment, destruction, the will to annihilation. In the other case, suffering, the crucified as the innocent one, counts as an objection to this life, as a formula for its condemnation. One will see that the problem is that of the meaning of suffering, whether a Christian meaning or a tragic meaning. In the former case, it is supposed to be the path to a holy existence. In the latter case, being is counted as holy enough to justify even a monstrous amount of suffering. The tragic man affirms even the harshest suffering. Dionysus cut to pieces is a promise of life. It will be eternally reborn and return again from destruction.
Yes, yeah. So I think that's a really beautiful way of sort of contrasting those two positions. So what Girard does is he kind of um, links it to his theory of scapegoating. He says, he implies that Nietzsche kind of knew about this and is actively advocating it, basically. Um,
Mm.
so in a really brief nutshell, and correct me if I've gone too far astray here, but
Mm.
Girard's theory of scapegoating is basically societies, in order to form, in order to remain stable, they need to scapegoat people. That is
Yeah.
to say, at least in the earliest times, literally murder innocent people, so that the whole
Mm.
community can come together around that act of murder and not be fighting each other perpetually. And that this
Yeah.
is the basis of civilization. Is that a fair summary?
No, that's very fair. Yes, that's correct.
And
So, by
so,
the way, that also means that it doesn't particularly matter whether or not the person scapegoated is innocent or
right,
guilty. It's just
yeah,
like, well, the function is for the community, not, it doesn't really matter whether or not the person is.
right, yeah, yeah, yeah. So, so Girard sort of links this passage by Nietzsche, links Nietzsche's idea of the Dionysian to this scapegoating process in society. For
Mhm.
instance, Nietzsche, because Dionysus is an interesting god. There's a story that he was torn apart by Titans, but there's also
Mhm.
stories where he's sort of like intoxicates mobs of people. He like leads to the deaths of people. Um, so there's a sense in which, at least for Girard, he's the affirmation of that process of violence on which society is built, of
Yeah.
victimizing on which society is built. Christ is the opposite. Christ is the innocent victim that we see, we recognize as the innocent victim, and he throws a spanner in the works. He brings that mechanism of scapegoating to a if not a halt, at least makes it very problematic.
Mhm.
Um, I think there's maybe I think there's a level of truth to that. I think that Nietzsche might have been aware of that to some extent. There's that, in the famous "God is dead and we have killed him" quote.
Mhm.
He does talk about establishing festivals of atonement for their deeds,
Yeah.
which is a very interesting phrase, very suggestive. Like, well, that seems directly linked to what Girard is saying. Where I part ways with Girard on that is that I think that what Nietzsche is fundamentally interested in, and what he's fundamentally doing with that dichotomy, is he's talking about attitudes towards life and nature, not just society. And Girard doesn't, at least in this article, address that issue at all. And so, if we're in the Christian epoch, let's
Mhm.
just imagine that everyone does become perfectly Christian, not half-hearted Christians, not sort of Christians afflicted by resentment, but full 100% authentic Christians. Is nature not going to be violent anymore? Sorry, do
Yeah.
you need to?
Wait 1 second. Was that a knock? Okay, maybe. Like I'll finish this up. I don't think it was a knock, and otherwise I'll hear a knock again. I'll finish
Okay,
up.
I'll try and keep this to like
Yes.
3 minutes
Yes. Sorry.
max. Um,
Yeah.
and then we can break there. Um,
Yeah.
I'll end on the question and we can come back
Yeah.
to it. So my question would be, let's say that everyone becomes a perfect Christian.
Mhm.
Does nature cease to be violent? Does life cease to involve suffering? Does existence cease to have chaos and chance in it? Does the universe become just? Like, in other words, if we take that Girardian aspiration to its maximum, we're still left with a universe that is fundamentally violent, victimizing, chaotic, and so on and so forth. And that's what Nietzsche is trying to deal with, I think. And to say that we're going to stop victimizing among humans is all well
Yeah.
and good, but
Yeah.
if humans did that to the utmost, they would still be in radical disalignment with nature. Human society, in a certain sense, would be good. But also, one has to wonder, would it be good, or would it just be the last man? I mean, like, how good is
Right.
it to be completely peaceful? And so that's where I think that Nietzsche has a more plausible answer. His answer is maybe not his answer. He's not obviously not saying we should scapegoat people. I don't think he's not saying we should pick random victims and scapegoat them. But I think he is saying we have to affirm that life has suffering, life is violent, and that we are life. And so, yeah, my question would be, what's the alternative to that? What's Girard proposing? What's Christianity proposing? And there, perhaps we should leave.
Yeah. Yeah, I've like tons of thought, and but I'll leave that. I'll re-listen to this part for the next time we talk, and I think we can go a little bit more in depth on this particular topic because this is really fascinating. And I think Gerard would have some answers for you specifically. The Christian thing, I don't know, like I'm not omniscient, but this has been really fascinating. So I wanna, yeah, thank you for that. Really good.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, we'll do the second part soon.
Yeah, sure. Sounds very good. Okay,
Cool.
wonderful.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. Have a good day.
Yes, thank you. You too.